Good afternoon. Today the motorcycle I'd like to share with you is one of my bikes that I really enjoy riding as well as looking at, and that's my red line frame Yamaha 650 flat tracker. The frame was made in 1968. If you notice when you look at this frame, what you'll see is first of all, it's not painted. The reason they don't paint the frames is because if the frames are painted, the paint will actually hide some of the cracks. Whereas on this bike, what they do is they take it through a process after it's welded up and they dip it in nickel. If in fact they break the bike, they'll be able to see the crack and either throw the frame out and get a new one or repair it. One of the big differences between a street bike and a race bike that does half miles, the rake of the frame, which is the angle of the forks, is brought in. It's reduced. What that does is it makes the bike turn incredibly well, but it makes it less stable when you're going in a straight line. The most unique feature of this particular race bike is the motor. In flat track racing, in quarter mile, half mile, and TT racing, Harley-Davidson has dominated the sport since it began. In addition to that, in the late 60s and 70s, the Triumphs and BSAs won several national championships. The reason this is significant is because up until that point in time, the Harleys and the Triumphs and the BSAs were very unreliable. To try and pull any horsepower out of them, they broke all of the time. Yamaha built a motor that was bulletproof, makes great horsepower, and fast. In fact, this particular bike sounds similar to a Triumph, and with very few modifications will run right past the BSAs, the Triumphs, and the Harleys in this particular case. So we're going to talk about some of the features of this bike, what makes it very interesting. The workmanship on a red line frame is just incredible. There were other contemporary frame manufacturers of this time, one that comes to mind is Champion, but if you take a look at this, if you take a look at their welds, they're absolutely gorgeous. I've never seen a machine that's able to make a weld as nicely as that. As I'm pointing this out, you can also see the silver color. This is nickel plating, and if you think about this, this nickel plating has been on this motorcycle since 1968. And it looks as good today as it did back then. We have the disc brake setup in the rear. Again, they didn't have these in the 60s, they used drum brakes. But really starting in the early 70s, they went to a rear disc. In the old days, the exhaust systems on flat track or race bikes were completely open. In other words, this is a muffler that we see here. This happens to be a super trap. In the old days, you wouldn't have had this rear section. You wouldn't have had this section right here. What you would have had is a wide open pipe, and it would have been as loud as you can imagine. In fact, many of the racers from that period, including an actor by the name of Keenan Wynn, they lost their hearing before they were 40 years old because of the noise that came out of these bikes. On this side of the bike, what you'll notice is a unique feature that you're only going to find on a flat track bike. On a flat track, you only turn left. You go in a straight line, you turn left, it's kind of like NASCAR racing. So on a racetrack, the bike is leaned over so far that parts of the motorcycle can drag. And of course that's very dangerous because if you drag the motor case, for example, it lifts the rear tire off the track and you'll crash. And it's happened to many riders. So on a Yamaha, for example, there's a part of the motor that would grab the dirt and would spit guys off. So they modified it. And if you look at this, what they did was they took, this normally is round, and it would be round down to this area. So it was a very simple thing. They would grind off the case, they put a new ignition in here, and then curved it. By curving it, this particular unit, when they're turning left, might be a quarter of an inch off of the ground. As of last year, I realized I'm not going to do any flat tracking anymore, but I really want to ride the bike. So I said to myself, hey, let's make it into a street tracker. My friend said, well, that's a great idea, but how are you ever going to get it licensed? It's really a dirt bike. Believe it or not, this motorcycle that I'm standing next to is street legal, and in fact, I ride it around town all the time. So what I did to make it into a street tracker is pretty simple. I bolted on the front tire that had the brake on it, so I had a front brake as well as a rear brake. I went to my computer store and I found a 12-volt battery that's about this big. I then made a mounting plate for it underneath the number plate. From that battery, I then ran some wires to a switch, and then from the switch I ran wires to a front headlight system I developed and a rear brake light. I simply went into my garage, I took out my woodworking tools, got a hole saw, and I drilled 2 holes in the number plate that was on this motorcycle the last time it ran the Sacramento Mile. And at night, believe it or not, when I hit the switch, the lights come on. They'll last for about a half an hour because the motorcycle doesn't have a charging system and works quite well. I also needed a brake light, so I was able to send away to England for a brake light switch. It's a universal switch, so that when I hit the rear brake, the rear tail light would go on. I also needed a tail light and a place to mount the license plate if I was lucky enough to get one issued by the CHP and the Department of Motor Vehicles. And if you come back here, I'll show it to you. There's really not much to it. It's actually a very nice piece. It's made out of thick anodized aluminum and actually has lightning holes in it. And again, it's got a chopper style rear tail light, but I kind of like it because it's really a 60s piece. I did that. I put it in the back of my truck and I went to the CHP office and told them I needed an inspection because I wanted to license my motorcycle for the street. The officer who came out is a motorcycle enthusiast. He looked it over. He complimented me on what a cool motorcycle it was and said he would go in and do some research. About a half hour later, he came out, he handed me the paperwork. He put 2 plates on the bike, one on the frame and one on the motor. And all of a sudden I had numbers that were legal. He licensed it as a 1968 Yamaha. I took that to my DMV office where they gave me a license plate. The funny thing is, even though it looks like a race bike, it has numbers, there really aren't any visible lights. I've never been stopped, and half the time when an officer sees me coming down the road, they give me the thumbs up, and they'll say something like, "Great bike," or "I had one of those when I was young."